uncovered what I, oops, somebody just interrupted me. What I think is a really marvelous example of the interconnectedness within the natural world. And I know you're really going to enjoy Zachary's talk. So Zachary is currently a PhD student in the, got to get this straight, it's the Pacific Salmon Ecology and Conservation Lab at the University of British Columbia. But before this, he did his master's degree, also at UBC, under the supervision of the famous whale expert, Andrew Treitz, who I know some of you are familiar with. And it was while doing his research for his master's degree that Zachary was able to solve part of the mystery around missing juvenile salmon. And this is what we're going to hear about tonight. So welcome, Zachary. I'm so glad that you agreed to come and be our guest and tell us this marvelous story.
You didn't leave me any option. You asked me in such a polite manner. It's not an option.
Good.
No, I honestly, I relish in the opportunity to talk about this, because if it just in the last year and a bit, I feel I've gotten a little bit away from my herons, my beloved herons, and towards deeper and deeper into the salmon, which is expected because I'm now doing a PhD in salmon. But sort of the darker underbelly, it's I'm looking at a lot of sort of habitat restoration and mostly barrier remediation, old culverts and floodgates that are blocking tens of thousands of kilometers of stream habitat in BC. And it's gets me a little down every once in a while. So I like to think back to my heron days.
Oh, great. We'll have to have you back after you've got some of your PhD research under your belt.
Absolutely. Yeah. No, I've got probably another 4 years of PhD stuff going on, but there's always every single day, I think there's something that I'm learning that I would love to pass on. I need to get it out of my head into the world. So
great.
Oh yeah, so here I'll probably go ahead and share some pictures, How about it? Let's see if I can share my screen. That looks like the one. Perfect. And I'll just have to make this bigger. We got time.
Oh yeah.
There we go. Beautiful. Everyone can see a bit of a stunning image.
Looks good.
Yeah.
Perfect. So I studied herons at one point in the Marine Mammal Research Unit. I don't know how I fandangled my way into it, but it was a pretty good couple of years that I was working there. But before I ever came out to BC, I surprisingly did not know a whole lot about Pacific salmon. I didn't know all the species. I didn't know any of the fun facts. And I think I've come quite a bit of a way since then. But the way that I kind of got into research in general was actually in the Rocky Intertidal in Nova Scotia. And I was mostly focusing on mussels and snails. So I was looking into how mussels smell the presence of snail predators and actually grow thicker shells in response to deter their drilling. So basically these snails secrete a digestive enzyme that breaks down the outside of the mussel shell, and then they rasp it away with their tongue, and they bore a hole and then secrete digestive enzymes inside of the mussel, and then basically slurp up their meal. And I was actually quite fascinated with it. I probably would have spent my whole life doing that if I hadn't gotten so enamored in Andrew Treitz's work. And finally, actually, my grandmother was having knee surgery in Richmond, and I thought, okay, I can come out and help her. And it's a bit of an excuse to go visit Andrew. When I got here, she didn't need any help, and she was quite resistant to even hanging out with me. So I had quite a bit of time to go meet Andrew. And all in all, we were able to basically work out a way where I was going to come out and study seals. And obviously didn't work out quite that way, but it was a foot in the door, and I'm very appreciative that he allowed me to come in, and I'm also very appreciative to my grandmother for even agreeing for me to come out to begin with. So, but now I know there are 5 species of anadromous Pacific salmon. Anadromous meaning that they spawn and rear in the freshwater habitat, move out into the ocean where they live their adult life, and then come back to the river. Now, when I first saw this this diagram of the Pacific salmon life history, which looks a lot like that actually right over there, I was very confused in my first year biology course, and I never really nailed it down pat. It looked like one of those things that you just sort of pick up and you say, well, I'll never need that, and moved on. Now that I've been spending some time, it's actually it's one of the more beautiful life histories that I've ever seen, and so I thought I'd give you a little overview of sort of the way I see it. So it starts with the Pacific salmon coming upstream from the ocean. They basically, the first ones to arrive on the scene are the males. They will come back and they will basically fight amongst each other and basically tussle for prime rearing habitat. Prime rearing habitat being the perfect type of gravel to lay your eggs in and rear your young. Once they have that all figured out, all the tussles are done, the females start to roll back into town. The females will actually more so pick a gravel type than a male, but the male is associated with the gravel type, so they say, what the heck, you're here now. So, and the female will actually basically nuzzle her tail into the gravel and basically make a small divot, which is called a red, in which she'll deposit her eggs simultaneously with the male, who basically comes up and they sort of gyrate next to each other, and that's an indication that they're both going to be releasing their milk and eggs. And with some luck, some of those eggs actually land in the red. The female then moves upstream a little bit and starts creating another red, and because of the displaced gravel that she's actually moving around from the red that's coming up, it actually buries the subsequent red and actually protects a lot of the juveniles. So they basically lay reds, as many eggs as they can, and they'll lay about 5 or 6 reds generally before there's nothing left to be nuzzled away. And so these eggs are fertilized, and they'll basically stay in the intricacies of these rocks of the gravel for about 8 weeks. Or sorry, 8 weeks, 8 weeks to 4 months. And then during that time, there is actually quite a bit of mortality. So despite mother's best efforts, sometimes she doesn't happen to pick the best areas. So sometimes there's a lack of oxygen because there's not a lot of groundwater coming into that gravel spot, and which can suffocate the eggs. There's also a couple of nosy little predators that happen to be around. Bull trout happen to be in the eye just rearing up to spawn. And it's actually believed that maybe bull trout, their spawning time may be closely linked to the spawning time of sockeye, because they rely on the eggs that they basically steal or prey upon to get the energy that they need to then subsequently spawn. So there's a couple of predators in the way, but despite all the odds, about 5% of these eggs make it to the stage of alevin, which is when they actually emerge, and they're basically a larval form of a salmon. So the egg that you see here, which is full of omega-3s and all sorts of fatty acids and nutrients, is actually now this yolk sac, is what it's called. And the alevin will actually survive on that yolk sac for an additional 8 weeks, sort of living still in the gravel. So they're still subterranean. They're still under the rocks and moving around. And then as the yolk sac starts to sort of dwindle, they end up moving closer and closer to the surface of the water. And then eventually they make their first little jump at something that catches their eye, whether it be some sort of organic matter floating in the water or a bug. And then they are a full-fledged juvenile. So some species of salmon, in particular, pink and chum, right when they emerge as they're juveniles, they may eat a couple of insects, but they basically think, okay, I've had enough fresh water, I'm done with this place, and they'll take right off to the ocean. And they'll hang out in the estuary for a couple of months, but they're basically ocean dwelling from that point on. Whereas Chinook and coho will generally spend 6 to 12 months in the freshwater habitat, feeding on small insects, and they basically will actually position themselves behind larger rocks where natural eddies occur, and they'll basically wait for food to sort of trickle downstream, and that's what they'll feed on. And then as the food supply starts to dwindle and they start to feel some sort of an urge, they actually get into faster moving water, and eventually get moved downstream a little bit, and eventually they get what is called par marks, which is these little marks on the side of their bodies. And that's an indication that they've had some sort of a physiological change. So from the freshwater fish that they are, they're actually now ready to take on some saltwater, which is quite the feat, if you could imagine, going from a bath into the ocean. But so they'll basically, when they have these physiological changes, they'll start this migration downstream. And this migration can be quite impressive. It can be hundreds of kilometers in some systems. In some systems, it can be just a couple of kilometers. And eventually, though there is quite a bit of mortality along the way, some of them will make it to the estuary, where they'll hang out for an additional couple of months. Eventually, as they're growing, moving into deeper, colder waters, eventually moving to the coastal habitat as subadults, and then out into the ocean, which is a bit of a black box as to where they go from there. It's most of the technology that we use to track salmon. It's easily done when it's in fresh water and when we know the fish are coming back. But the ocean's a big, scary place, and it's still a bit of a mystery as to where these salmon are going beyond then. But eventually, they will feel the urge to turn around and come back home, and they'll actually come back towards the coastal habitat and follow their smell right back to their natal stream. So it's called olfactory reception. It's basically a memory that they have of a smell of the river that they were born in, and that's what they follow right back up to their natal stream. So they will continue on, and they will be they'll be spawning in the same area that their parents were spawning, or pretty darn close if they can get there. Now, from juvenile to this stage, there is not a whole lot of survival. So it's about 1% of fish, maybe. So it's about 1 to 2% of fish that make it out of the river will actually come back as adults. So there's a lot of places for them to go, but all along their life history, these fish are quite vital. They play a role everywhere they go, and they're always welcome. And in all of for all the reasons that they're important, one of the biggest ones is culturally and as a food source for First Nations communities, which have sustainably fished salmon in the Pacific Northwest for tens of thousands of years. And they've actually used selective techniques, so they don't necessarily just catch whatever fish comes by. They can actually catch fish as they're coming back to their specific river to spawn, and they catch them passively. So they catch them in basically rotating weaved baskets, and as a result, they can actually look at fish and say, if it's a fish that they want to keep, they can keep it. But if it's a fish they want to return, they've done no harm and they can put it back. And particularly, it's important as a food source, not just when the fish are coming back upriver, but because of preservation techniques such as smoking, which is what you see here. It actually provides vital proteins and nutrients throughout the year, which for nomadic people that can basically finally settle down when they found a reliable food source that can provide for them all year round. It's you can really understand why it's simply cultures were built around these fish, and communities were built around these fish. And just to mention, in past presentation that somebody asked what these dark lines on the fish were. And I didn't know at the time, but I've since conferred with somebody who knows much more about this sort of thing. And it turns out that these are actually strips that they take out of the body, which allows for an even smoking throughout. So if you were to smoke a big fillet of salmon, it would take a long time and some parts might not fully preserve. So this is something that allows for smoke to penetrate throughout the fish, which I thought was quite interesting. Now, additionally, there is also a commercial fishery that makes millions of dollars a year off of catching salmon. I don't necessarily support it entirely, so I decided that a grainy, out of focus shot would probably be the best description of it. But maybe one of the most important parts of salmon is actually for for ecology. So salmon for salmon's sake. And this is supported by the fact that there's over 137 species that rely directly or indirectly on salmon at some stage in their life. And that list is growing as we've found in my past research. And it's not necessarily that that it's just a feeding opportunity. It's that these fish actually feed full ecosystems as well, and they're considered a keystone species. And when I first heard this statement, the keystone species, I thought it was just an awfully nice, nice sounding phrase for an important species in ecology, but it's actually based off of the keystone in an archway, which, if you're looking at this archway, this would be the keystone. And the way that this archway is held up is not with cement or mortar or anything like that. It's actually pressure that's applied, and it's pressure that's brought in by this keystone that is applied and felt throughout the entirety of this archway, and it's what keeps this archway standing. So I think keystone species is a good way to put it when you're talking about salmon, because I think if you were to not have salmon, you would see a lot of unraveling in that archway, and it would be felt all the way to the bottom of the food chain. So I have a definite appreciation for these fish. And I just wanted to just outline one example of these sort of interspecies relationships that we've got 137 or more to choose from. I was in the Marine Mammal Research Unit. I wasn't studying marine mammals directly, but I felt some sort of shame in that. So I figured I should probably talk about, whales as best I can. I didn't study whales directly, but Josh McInnes, who took this wonderful picture, he did, and he does, and he is in the Marine Mammal Research Unit. And he obviously does some really beautiful field work, which I'm not at all envious of, I'm sure. And these species are important. So southern resident killer whales, northern resident killer whales are really important species, not just because they're, top predators in a very intricate oceanic food web, but actually their bodies, their mass, they're such large beings that as they dive deep in the water and come back, they physically churn the ocean, which is unbelievably important, because when you physically churn the ocean, you're mixing sort of nutrient poor water on the surface and oxygen poor water at the depth. And when you mix that oxygen and those nutrients, you actually create phytoplankton blooms, which is the very basis of the food web for the entire ocean. So, for a multitude of reasons, these are species worth studying, and these are species worth protecting. In the very least, protecting their food source, which is, over 90% of which is Chinook salmon. I elected not to speak directly about this relationship, even though I did go on a bit of a tangent. But I thought, because this is a broad group, we love hiking, we get out into nature in all sorts of ways, not just on the ocean. I figured that I would focus on something that's a bit more broad, and really puts this species on a scale that they deserve to be, and that is trees. So we all know that when these carcasses come back up the river, and the females and males spawn, they don't go anywhere else from there. They die in their natal streams, and those nutrients are completely vital, because it's one of very few bridges that bring nutrients from the ocean to the land. Generally, it's a one-way street. It's erosion that's drawing nutrients from the soil and throwing it into the ocean and bringing it out into the estuary, and that was the end of that story. So if you didn't have these bridges coming back, you wouldn't have a lot of nutrients for the terrestrial ecosystem that we love. And you can actually, the fun thing is that you can actually determine where nitrogen comes from. So nitrogen 15 is from the ocean, and other forms of nitrogen are terrestrial based. So nitrogen 15, up to 70% of the nitrogen, which is a limiting nutrient in the ocean, in the Pacific Northwest, up to 70% is provided by the ocean. And if it's provided by the ocean, it's in the Pacific Northwest, it's a really good chance it came from a salmon carcass. And additionally, it doesn't just stop at the trees. The invertebrates in that area, the bugs, up to 50% of their nitrogen is provided by marine sources, which would be once again salmon. Now it serves the entire ecosystem, but it's also a bit self-serving for the salmon, because they rely on the trees for riparian habitat, which not only sort of bolsters the shoreline that they rely on to basically protect their streams, but the riparian actually provides shade and cover, which is really important for maintaining a cool climate in the freshwater when the juveniles are around. But it also gives them places to hide, and it gives them places to sort of escape predators and escape sort of thermal tolerances, so warm places in the water. And the insects, which are also sort of salmon derived, are basically make up over 95% of the diet of the juvenile salmon before they out migrate to the ocean. So it does serve a greater purpose, but the salmon are also benefiting from the nutrients that they're providing, and it gives a good indication as to why you'd want to go and bring your young to the same area where you spawn, because you know that you're donating yourself to that area and to their well-being. So it really is a bit of a beautiful system. But the real connecting part of that particular system for the trees and the salmon is actually bears. So if you were to fill a river chock full of salmon carcasses and then call it quits, it wouldn't go very far. As you can imagine, not a lot of the trees are going to be getting much of those nutrients. But with bears, they basically draw out either spawning salmon, so salmon that aren't quite dead, or carcasses, and they'll basically bring them out. They'll eat a bit of it. They'll leave it on the shoreline for other kleptoparasites to come in. So eagles who are lining the river at this time of year will come in, take whatever remains are left, and they'll actually bring the nutrients way up into the forest. So even the highest peaks in the forest have salmon carcasses providing nutrients for them, and it's because of this long list of predators that are drawn to these spawning events, and it's because of that the salmon have the impact that they do. If there's an eagle nest on the top of a ridge, then there's going to be salmon that are coming to those root systems. So, but the thing is that the Pacific Northwest is really just the beauty and the bounty of the forest that we see is just a reflection of the health of the salmon populations that we support. And if you don't have that healthy salmon population, I guarantee that your forest wouldn't look quite the same. But there's a couple of other things that are interesting about that particular relationship between bears, trees, eagles, salmon, and the list seems to keep growing with every slide. But bears are actually quite picky eaters. So because they're basically, their main goal is to fatten up for winter, they prefer to eat fats. They don't like eating high protein because it takes a lot of energy to break down protein. So generally, if there's a lot of salmon around, they'll be rather picky. And in the females, they'll just eat the eggs or remaining eggs. And then in the males, they'll eat the brains and the hump. So the fattiest bits, which leaves a lot of leftovers for eagles to take into the forests, and it leaves a lot of leftovers for anything else that's sort of taking after those salmon that the bears happen to pick out of the river. But when you don't have a lot of salmon coming into the river, bears become less picky. So they eat more of the carcass, and as a result, they don't leave as much for eagles, bugs, trees, things to pick up. So it becomes a problem of, if you don't have a lot of salmon, it's not only you don't have a lot of salmon going to your trees, but it actually changes the behavior of this connecting piece, which is the bears. And that would probably have, one of the bigger impacts. And you see that where in areas where salmon populations are dwindling, there's fewer and fewer leftover carcasses. And as a result, that nutrient trail is going less and less far from the river. But interestingly, salmon or bears actually prefer berries, for the same reason that they only want to eat the eggs. If they can gorge themselves on berries and high sugar content, they can build up fat rather quickly and without a whole lot of effort. And they don't have to deal with a wiggling salmon in their mouth. They don't have to fight anyone to get a good spot to forage. They just sit down and have some berries. And normally, the way that the world works, there is no overlap. They never have to choose between salmon and berries, because generally the salmon will come up and spawn, and then a couple of months later, the berries will be ripening. So the bears can transition between food sources rather seamlessly. But with climate change, we've seen that there's actually berries are ripening more rapidly, and it creates this overlap where now there's salmon and berries present at the same time, which is a bit of a problem when the bears would prefer berries. And as a result, you get fewer bears foraging in streams. And once again, you miss that critical part of, a bear taking the salmon carcass out of the river and allowing for other organisms to feed on it and carry it further. So it's definitely, there's a couple of wrinkles to that system, which you would imagine to be a very straightforward, salmon carcass to the roots of trees system. It's got a lot of in-betweens, and it's really just an indicator of how important these species are and the sort of food webs that can be built off of them. And this is just one example of, as I was mentioning, over 130 that we could be talking about. But salmon populations aren't doing all too hot, particularly in their southern range, but it's a bit of a hit and a miss. Some populations are doing well and some populations aren't, but research has basically begun to shift towards what is causing the decline in some of these salmon populations. So what is the bottleneck? Where is the death? Clearly some salmon are dying if they're not making it back to spawn. So the question is sort of, where are these fish ending up if it's not at the spawning grounds? And one way that researchers have been getting to this is with these things called PIT tags, passive integrated transponder tags. These tags are about the size of a grain of rice, and they're implanted in the stomach cavity of the salmon as juveniles. The technology behind it is it's basically a small glass tube that has a metal coil on the inside. And when the metal coil comes in contact with a magnetic array, it picks up an electron, and basically that electron charges it. It sends out a radio signal, and then it beeps, and you can say, okay, this tag was detected at this antenna at this time. And it's actually really interesting because you'd imagine, okay, it's kind of, if somebody put a tag inside of your stomach, you'd think, okay, this is a bit of a burden. But these salmon, actually, it's such a small weight compared to their body weight that they'll actually just go up, gulp one gulp of air, expand their air bladder a little bit, and they're completely compensated for that weight. So they basically unknowingly are carrying these tags around. It doesn't have any sort of impact that would change their survival necessarily. But one other sort of fun thing about these pit tags is that because they only emit a signal when they're charged by a magnetic array, they actually lay dormant most any time of day. So over 99.99% of their life, they're not emitting anything, which is really good because that means it's not wasting any energy, it's not wasting any battery, and these tags can actually survive for years. So, it can survive for 5 years until the fish comes back as an adult, or if the tag is deposited somewhere else, someone could come and find it, 10 years later if they needed to. So because of the sort of the aspects of this technology, it's really opened up the gate to understanding sort of how these fish are responding and reacting in their freshwater habitat. But very interestingly, what we found is that, past research has found that surprisingly, a lot of these fish are, so these are some of the detectors that detect the fish as they go by in the river system and collect the data on how far they make it, what time of year they're traveling, what individual it is, and then different factors like, does size, species, time of year influence survival or movement of these fish. But interestingly, a lot of that research has found that as many as 50% of the juvenile salmon die before they ever make it to the estuary. Which, don't get me wrong, if you stuck me in a river and told me to swim 100 kilometers downstream to the estuary, I'd likely be coming up for air and I might not make it myself. But it's a little bit troubling when you think of how far these fish have to go, and they're dying in the first couple of weeks that they emerge. when they have another, 2 to 5 years to survive in the ocean. So it was a bit troubling, and this is sort of where I came in, which was, where the heck are these juvenile salmon going? I ended up looking at a system in the Cowichan where a lot of the juvenile salmon weren't just not making it to the end of the estuary. They were actually not. They were being taken directly out of the river system. So it wasn't that there was a bull trout that ate a salmon and it was swimming around and we thought, okay, what's this crazy juvenile salmon up to now? The tags were actually disappearing, which would suggest that there's something outside of the river that's taking them out, which is where I started to focus, which is basically terrestrial predators. And the way that I did this was trying to find these dormant tags in the scat of the predator. So after a fish has been eaten, the tags are really quite small, and glass, when it's that small, is quite strong as well. So most times it passes directly through the digestive tract of the predator, and it lays on the ground waiting for somebody with enough time and energy to come out and try to find it. And so that's what I kind of set out to do. And I knew exactly where I was going to find them when I set out and when I signed up for the project. There's a big list of literature on predators of juvenile salmon in the river system. And so I thought, okay, it's got to be one of these guys. I just know it. And so I started looking in otter latrines, mink dens, crawling around trying to find raccoons, hanging out near merganser haulouts, basically trying to hang around and see if they would give me any hints. And then the sort of surefire one that I had was kingfishers, which are a well-known predator of small fish, but even juvenile salmon in particular, they're known to prey upon them. So I spent 4 months searching through all of the areas I could find where predators would hang out along the Cowichan. And to my surprise, my supervisor's surprise, everybody that was involved in the project, I ended up finding absolutely nothing. And it was a long 4 months. And it was a tiresome 4 months of explaining to myself that, this isn't your fault. This is there's something coming. There's obviously someone's taking these and taking them home. It's not you, but it was me. And so I had moved on. As you do in science, you have to keep trudging along. So I had begun. All the fish had moved out of the freshwater system into the estuary. I thought, okay, I'll see if there's something in there I can get into. Seals are another known predator, so I basically switched my efforts into trying to find tags on seal haulouts and underneath log booms. And I was actually getting a ride out to seal haulouts from local Cowichan tribes biologist Tim Kolchinsky, and I was airing my woes probably for the 5th or 6th day in a row before Tim finally looked over his shoulder and saw that there was a bunch of birds feeding at the mouth of the river. And he sort of looked back and suggested, have you ever looked into great blue herons? And I thought, of course, I've never looked into that because that seems obvious. So Tim thankfully pointed me in the right direction to the local Cowichan tribe heronry. That day I went and I ended up finally finding a predator, which was exciting for me. That day I ended up finding 80 tags, which is a lot of tags when you found 0 over the course of 4 months. I ended up going back, tinkering with my mobile antenna, basically added a little beeper function so I could know when I found tags, so I could know which areas to search more frequently, what kind of things to look for. Turns out if you look for the big white splotches under the heron nest, those generally are the spots to look. To date, I ended up finding about 1,200 tags in different heronries around British Columbia. So when I looked at this, I thought, okay, now that I know, it seems so obvious that it must have been herons all along. Herons there must be some other study that's found that herons are a salmon predator, especially when I looked into it and I found that heronries, so herons, they breed in these colonies called heronries, and they generally are situated within 5 or 15 kilometers of a food source, a reliable food source. And if you look in British Columbia where heronries are located, it's quite rare to find one that's not near a salmon-bearing river. And so, okay, the herons are there, but they must not be feeding on small fish at that time. Otherwise, if someone would have figured this out by now. It turns out that's pretty much exactly what they're looking for at that time of year. When they're feeding their young in particular, they need really small fish because the young have small gapes. And so that's a high choking hazard if you bring home a big bass for your baby fish or for your baby heron. So so the more I looked into it, the more I realized that herons are kind of the perfect predator for salmon, for juvenile salmon as they're moving out. And just to give you a quick overview, so Pacific great blue herons are non-migratory, which means that when it's wintertime, not in the breeding season, they don't go anywhere else. They don't stay in the heronry, as you can see, because that's reserved for insane people that are just hanging out, which happen to just be me on this particular day. But the birds aren't there. What they actually do is they break up from their breeding colonies and they become relatively solitary. And they go primarily foraging in estuary habitats, but also farmers' fields. And they feed on small mammals. So in this picture, it's a gopher, but they generally feed on voles and different things like that. And during this time, they are extremely solitary. I tried to approach a couple of them. They don't want to hang around anyone. They're just in it for themselves. So why do they? But then, why do they hang out together when they're breeding? Well, aside from the fact that they need other herons to breed with, there is this idea of sort of safety in numbers. So you've got a lot of energy that you're putting into your young. You don't necessarily want to put all your energy into cranking your neck every time you hear an eagle swooping by. And the eagle is actually one of the main reasons that these heron colonies form in such numbers, is because they do need some sort of a warning system, and they do need some sort of protection from predatory eagles, which are kleptoparasites. They steal food for a living, so they're really good at stealing baby chicks, eggs, and a weak adult if they can get it. But so you would think, okay, eagle, I just saw an eagle eat my neighbor, I should probably avoid this thing if I can. Interestingly, that is not the case at all. So heronries will actually set up around eagles' nests, and it's this thing called mob protection, where basically eagles are so protective, and so there's basically so much competition between eagles, and they're so protective of their area that they'll actually draw away other eagle predators. So instead of having a community not around any eagles and you have to feed every transient eagle that happens to come by that day, you basically have 2 or 3 eagles' nests of eagles that you reliably feed, but that overall protect you from other eagle predators. And there's actually a study where they found that when an eagle nest picked up and moved elsewhere, the heronry would slowly over the years migrate back to around that eagle nest. So it's this really interesting mob mentality. So there is protection in numbers, but this kind of brings us to the breeding season. So the first ones to show up at the nest. So breeding colonies will last for about 20 years, and herons will reliably come back to that same area, and they'll keep coming back to that area until there is no more twigs, no more vegetation. They've basically crapped on everything that's living, and the dead stand that's left over is no longer suitable for their nests, after which they'll continue on and move to a different area. But when they come back to these sort of known heronries, the first ones to come back are males. And they'll basically fight each other for the best nests that are existing, for the best branches, the Bayview branches, if that's what they're looking for. But more realistically, what they're looking for is an area where they can see predators coming and they can attain food easily. And so once that's all the squabbles are figured out, there's a couple of herons that can't stand to look at each other, but they've got themselves all situated. And at that point, the females will sort of move into town. The males will put on these sort of extravagant displays that this doesn't necessarily invoke, emotions of romance in me, but actually over the years it's now started to, because I've spent enough time around these birds. But this is kind of what you're looking for. If you're a female, you're looking for a big, strong male with, nice, bright, vibrant feathers, which is suggestive of, this guy's been feeding himself. I'm sure he could feed one of my young for the next couple of months. And then once the female has sort of chosen her mate, they will be monogamous for that season. The next year could be a different situation. It doesn't necessarily mean that they're monogamous for life, but for the season, they will be one male, one female, sort of helping each other. And the male will generally be sent out to pick up twigs and things, and he'll bring them back, and the female will weave the nest. The nest can be quite big, about 3 meters across in some instances, which is a big old home. So there's a lot of foraging going on. And then the male will actually bring back different mosses and things, which are sort of an antibacterial, but also a nice protective cushion for the eggs and a nice insulation for the nest as well. So a lot of care and consideration goes into these nests. And then eventually these eggs are laid, and then a couple of months later, you have your first chick emerging. And so when you think, okay, if you're going to be that big right out the gate, and you want to be a bird that has a 6-foot wingspan, you're going to take your time to grow. But that doesn't happen to be the case for herons. So herons can grow to 6-foot wingspan within 8 weeks. To put that into terms that we can all understand, it's like having a baby about the size of your palm grow to 6 feet tall in 8 weeks. So you can imagine you're going to need to feed that thing, and you're going to need to feed it quick, and you're going to need to feed it a lot of food. Sorry, I'm just going to peter off because I got to get my charger in order, but I'll continue on. So these chicks are growing quickly, and they're growing, and they're pretty angry. If you've ever hung out underneath a heron nest during breeding season, everyone's a little tense up there, is what I've picked up, and they're very vocal about how much they need some food and how unwilling they are to accept no food at all. So there's quite a task at hand, and generally the females and the males will split the foraging time 50-50. So there will always be one adult tending to the nest, tending to the birds, and there will be one adult going out and foraging. And so that was just a bit of a summary of herons in general. And it brings me to this, which is, okay, what are these guys feeding on? Clearly, as you can imagine, it's a little bit of salmon. So once I found that herons were my sort of the object of my desire, I came up with a couple of research questions. Primarily, what impact does heron predation have on outmigrating salmon smolts? All the funding that I'd gotten for this project was salmon-centric, so I assumed they wanted to know something or other about salmon. So I set that as my first goal. Second, where does this predation occur? So where along the life history are these herons actually picking up the juvenile salmon, and where along their migration? Do things like smolt size influence susceptibility? So does the size of the juvenile salmon influence susceptibility to heron predation? Or are the herons selecting a larger fish, or are the smaller ones easier to get away? So there was a couple of questions related to the size of the fish. And finally, sort of, the question that I was actually really interested in was, what does smolt predation mean for the herons? Like these birds have been foraging reliably on juvenile salmon for likely millennia. The fact that I just found out 2 years ago that predation was happening doesn't mean that it isn't a really important part of their life history as well. So it kind of brought me into a whole, a well-rounded idea of what this foraging circle looks like. So just to give you an overview of where I was working, the Cowichan River is where I spent those 4 months of agony. And in the Cowichan, they've been releasing about 10,000 tagged wild and hatchery reared juvenile salmon per year from 2014 to 2018. So lots of tags for me to go out and find potentially. I ended up finding 458 at the local heronry, and this represented over 1% of the juvenile salmon. Now, that doesn't sound like a whole heap of salmon, as you can imagine, when there's, as I was mentioning, over 95% of these fish are going to die one way or another along their life history. What's another 1% basically? But it's actually pretty impressive when you look at it in terms of the herons. So 1 to 5% of all juvenile salmon, which are hundreds of thousands of juvenile salmon moving out of the Cowichan system, are being eaten by 100 active nests, so 200 birds in the Cowichan system. Now that's a lot of foraging, and that's got to be a pretty effective foraging strategy that they have. So when you look at it in terms of what the herons are actually doing, these numbers are actually quite startlingly high. Up there, once I found this, I thought, okay, is there anywhere else that people have been releasing pit tags? And it turns out there are a couple of other spots. So the BC Conservation Foundation, the people who basically helped me with this project entirely and did a lot of the pit tagging and did all the pit tagging in the Cowichan system, they had also released 40,000 pit tagged hatchery reared coho salmon in 2015 in the Big Qualicum River. And that was released in a group of about 300,000 hatchery fish. And I ended up finding 136 of those tags in a local heronry, which only had 20 birds. So if you can think of 300,000 fish going by in that 1 year, and these 20 birds somehow picked out a third of 1% of them, it really is quite impressive. And then the other area where they are, which we're all probably pretty familiar with, is the Capilano River, where they've released on average about 4,000 tagged hatchery reared coho per year from 2008 to 2018. They were really adamant about this early on. So there's about 10,000 fish released in the first couple of years. And then after that, funding dwindled and they just started releasing a couple of thousand a year. And I was actually able to find 605 of those tags in the Stanley Park Heronry, which represents 1.3% of the juvenile salmon per year on average over those years. So it was taken into account basically that even though I found 1% of the tags, it's likely that I didn't find every tag that was eaten by a heron. Especially when you consider the fact that herons don't exclusively defecate in the heronry. So they don't always rush home to go to the bathroom. They go to the bathroom wherever they please. And when I basically was trying to fix these numbers to understand, okay, if I find 1% of the tags, how many tags is that? How many fish does that actually represent? And there was actually a similar study done in the Columbia River with cormorants, which have a relatively similar life history to herons and foraging style and everything. And these double-crested cormorants, they had found that when they fed them a known number of tags, they defecated about half of them in the heronry or in the rookery, and half of the tags were defecated elsewhere. This tends to make sense when you think about birds. They're generally are trying to minimize the weight that they have when they're flying, so they will defecate before taking off or as they're taking off. And for herons, which are a bird that take off, go directly to a known foraging habitat, forage for a little bit, and then take off and go home, it makes sense that about half of those tags would make it back, would be defecated in the breeding colony, and half of them defecated somewhere else where I'd never be able to find them. So when we corrected these tag recoveries to come up with an actual predation estimate, it ended up being about 3% of the fish were being likely preyed on by herons, 0.6% up in the Big Qualicum system, and then about 2.9 or about 3% in the Capilano. And there was a bit of variability in the years. So this was on average about 3%, but it could be as high as 6% in some years, which is really getting into some numbers where people would like to know where these, where 6% of salmon are going is kind of a fun little finding. Now you might notice a bit of discrepancy. So in the Cowichan system and in the Capilano system, you have about 3% of the fish being preyed on, whereas in the Big Qualicum, it's less than 1%. So I have come up with a pretty good rationale for that, which is that in the Big Qualicum, so in the Capilano River and in the Cowichan River, the fish have quite a little ways to go. So they have about 20 some odd kilometers to go in the Cowichan system, and then from the Capilano Dam, I forgot what that dam's name is, but anyways, from the Capilano system, from the dam, the Cleveland Dam, they have about 10 kilometers to go. In the Big Qualicum, they're actually released about 2 kilometers upstream from the estuary, and they're all released at once. So all the hatchery fish, 300,000 hatchery fish, are released within the same week. So in the Cowichan system and in the Capilano, the herons actually have an opportunity to sort of clue into the salmon. So they see a couple of salmon going by in the stream and they say, okay, I'm going to come back here tomorrow. I think I'm going to catch some salmon. Whereas in the big Qualicum, by the time they notice that the salmon are there, they're already out of the river system and into the estuary where they're harder to get at. So it's this idea called predator swamping, where you basically have so many food options that they can't possibly eat as many as they'd like. And so that's kind of the reason I suspect that predation is so much lower in the big Qualicum, but nothing to scoff at still. It's still quite a bit of predation. And you would think, okay, so these must be the only heronries near these river systems if they're the only heronries where I found tags. But actually, all of these stars are heronries in the area. So in the Cowichan system, there's about 3 kilometers away, there's a heronry at Maple Bay. About 10 kilometers south of the Big Qualicum River, there's a heronry, and then there's heronries at Deep Deer Lake Park and out near Point Roberts. So, oh, sorry, and this is Tsawwassen actually. So this is the biggest heronry in North America right here, not all too far from where these fish are being released. So in total, over 99% of the tags I found were in those 3 heronries. And I found less than 6 tags in the other heronries, even though those herons are within striking distance, basically, which is kind of indicative of what I think is a bit of niche partitioning, where maybe one of the reasons that heronries form and why these divides form among groups of herons is because they have their own area that they like to forage, and maybe they defend the area that they're foraging in. So the Maple Bay herons don't forage in the same area as the Cowichan, and as a result, they don't eat the same salmon that I found in the Cowichan heronry. So that was just sort of an interesting little takeaway that I had, was that it seems to be that the closest heronry is really tuned into those river systems, whereas the other ones, they don't quite get the memo, or they don't forage in the same area necessarily. So in the Cowichan system, about half the fish were tagged and released in the lower river, so they actually traveled through the river, and then there was extra tagging operations that happened in the estuary. So in total, about half the fish were tagged in the river, and then half of them were tagged as they had exited the river in the estuary. And what I found was that not a lot of the fish that I recovered, so fewer than 50, fewer than 20 tags really in any year, were from the estuary fish, whereas over 95% of the tags that I found were from river fish. And there's a couple of reasons for this potentially. For one thing, when the fish move into the estuary, they have more room to spread out. There's quite a bit more room to play in. So for a heron, if you're a heron and you want to reliably catch a salmon today, because as I was mentioning, those nagging chicks are waiting at home and they're going to be hungry, they may choose to go to the river because it's easier to catch the salmon and it's more reliable and it's a smaller volume. But this is also this breakdown that you see here. You might notice that there's a bit of a spike, and it's quite the spike when you look at all the other years and all the tag recoveries. And this is 2016, and there is a reason that year really stands out, and it's because in 2016 in the Cowichan, there was critically low water flow. So there was a bit of a drought, and the weir, it's a weir operated river system, and they weren't able to release enough water as the juveniles were out migrating, which resulted in really low water flow. And what happens when you have really low water flow is that as a juvenile salmon, if you're trying to get out of the river system, you're either moving as quick as you can, or you're holding off and you're hiding. You don't want to be lollygagging. You don't want to be open to predation, basically. But the thing is that when there's not a lot of water in the river system, that water is moving relatively slow. And as a result, those juvenile salmon are moving relatively slow. So they spend more time traveling through areas where there's a lot of herons that happen to be foraging. So you think, okay, well, if I'm moving so slow, I might as well get off the river as a juvenile salmon. But the problem is that when the river level is low, you get pulled away from that riparian habitat, which I was mentioning is really important for fish to hide, and it adds a lot of complexity for them to sort of tuck away from predation events. So you basically not only have fish moving slower through the system, but they don't have a lot of areas to hide. And as a result, as you can see, the herons really tuned in that year. And it's likely indicative of other predators that were feeding in the river that year, and it was found that there was really low juvenile salmon survival in that year. So kind of a key takeaway of this is that there is a real strong importance for providing enough fresh water for juvenile salmon to move out of the river during this critical life history stage, to sort of give them that push past potential threats. But we didn't see that same relationship in the Capilano system, and there's actually a pretty good reason for that, and it is that when those fish are moving out of that system, when I was in the Cowichan system, I actually saw that the herons were lining along the mouth of the river, so they were waiting for the juvenile salmon or whatever other forage fish were in the water at that time to come out of the river into the estuary. But in the Capilano, I actually used the eBird website to find out, which a lot of you probably participated in and provide a lot of critical data for research like this. But the eBird website gave me a good indication of where herons are seen foraging during the breeding season. And it turns out that in the Stanley Park, they're not lining themselves at the mouth of the Capilano River. So here's Stanley Park, here's the Capilano River over here, and this is the Stanley Park Heronry. And the birds are not flying over and lining the mouth of the Capilano River, but they're actually foraging primarily on the nearshore habitat along Stanley Park and along West Vancouver and the North Shore. So they're probably foraging on salmon in a different part of their life history or a different part of their migration than the Cowichan system. More so when they're in that nearshore habitat as they're continuously eating, and as they grow, the juvenile salmon are moving further and further offshore into deeper waters where wading predators such as herons can't get to them anymore. So the window in which they're foraging is actually different, which was really interesting to see that, even in this relatively small study area, we did see behavioral differences in the foraging tactics used by these herons. So, it's just an indication of how these herons have been getting along for quite some time, and it's not always the same strategy. So with the tags that I put out, I was actually able to look into a couple of cool little features. One of which was I could see the size of the fish when they were released, which was generally within a week since before they were preyed on by the herons. So a good indicator of what size they were when the herons were foraging on them. And what I found was that in every system where we had size data, we found that herons were foraging on smaller juvenile salmon. So in this figure, you can see this is the size of all the juvenile salmon released and not found at heronries. And this is the size of juvenile salmon that were released and recovered at heronries. And in all years, this little star indicates that it's a significant difference between those two, which means that this isn't just a happenstance that smaller fish are ending up there. It's likely something that's driving it. And we saw this more so in hatchery fish, which is on this side, than wild fish, likely because, as you can see, there's a more narrow size range in wild fish than there are in hatchery fish, which means that there's less opportunity for fish to act differently behavior-wise, because they're all kind of the same size. So there's not really any difference in the size in their behaviors or their movements or their ability to be sort of seen by a predator. And so when I thought of this, I thought this was quite interesting, because if I was a heron, 6-foot wingspan, hungry kids at home, I don't want to go catching fish all day. I'd rather catch one big fish and bring it home if I could. But it's likely that smaller juvenile fish are slower at getting away. So when a heron strikes, a larger juvenile fish can move faster, but a smaller one can't move quite as fast. So it may be sort of more easy to strike. Also, smaller juvenile salmon move through the system more slowly, so they may also be spending more time in the areas where herons are hanging out than the larger fish that are sort of zooming past. But also, there's this really cool behavioral difference where larger fish, because they're so full, they're more likely to sort of hide off and wait because they have nothing to lose. They basically got fat to burn. They're not dying for a meal. Whereas smaller fish will act in a riskier behavior. They're hungry. They're willing to go out late night and get a meal if they have to. And so as a result, you actually see smaller fish in sort of these areas where they may be more likely to attract a predator than the larger conspecifics. There's also a kind of a cool relationship where larger conspecifics, so larger juvenile salmon, actually outcompete smaller juvenile salmon for refuge habitats, so hiding places. So if you could imagine, going hiding as a kid with your cousins, and your larger cousin has the spot under the desk, there's no way that you're getting in there. He's going to kick you out. It's the same way for these juvenile salmon, where these larger fish are basically able to push out the smaller ones and maybe make them more susceptible to this heron predation. So usually you would think, okay, all death, all mortality is bad. So any fish being eaten is not good for the salmon, and we probably shouldn't have it that way. But when you look at situations like this, where smaller fish are being preyed on more heavily, a bunch of research has found that smaller juvenile salmon are less likely to survive to adulthood, but they still survive to the estuary a lot of the time. So they're not surviving long enough to basically push that population forward and come back as a spawner, but they may be surviving long enough to compete with other stronger conspecifics for limited food resources. So sort of weaning out the small ones that are less likely to survive anyways may actually be opening up more food resources and reducing competition in the estuary for larger conspecifics. So there is a situation where this heron predation is likely beneficial to salmon populations, which is generally, it's hard to wrap your head around it sometimes, but I think there's a reason that herons and salmon have been getting along just fine for millennia. So in the Cowichan system, I went out in 1 year after after that 4-month season where I found nothing, and then I found something at the end. The next year I was able to straggle together a couple of bucks, live in my truck, and basically post up outside of the heronry. And I did daily rookery scans to basically try to find when are these tags showing up relative to where the fish are moving in the river system. And what I found was that May 22nd, which is the hatchery release, fish are showing up almost immediately afterwards. So the herons are tuning into the salmon quite quickly. But clearly there's a bit of communication in the heronry where herons see other herons coming back with food to feed their young, and the next day they follow them to the area that they're foraging. And as a result, you can see that herons are sort of tuning into the salmon, really feeding for almost a full month on juvenile salmon at a quite consistent rate, basically the entirety of the time that they're moving out of the river system. And then it eventually peters off. And this is likely when the juvenile salmon have moved out of the river, out of the nearshore habitat, into the deeper waters where wading herons just can't access them anymore. But what's really interesting about this is that this predation happens to overlap almost perfectly with chick rearing in the heronry. So chick rearing is when, so another thing that we found was that the tags were evenly distributed throughout the heronry. So it wasn't just that there was a couple of salmon specialists, herons, that just knew where to find the salmon, and every year we're going out and bringing home salmon to their young, but almost all the herons were participating in the salmon foraging. So clearly this is something that is quite a common theme in these heron colonies. But as I was saying, it overlaps perfectly with chick rearing. So chick rearing is the 2 weeks after the chick is hatched, but it can't feed itself at all, and it's growing really quickly. But it has this gape limitation where it has a really small mouth. So a lot of food objects, or a lot of food options, are actually quite dangerous for the heron chicks because it's a choking hazard. So there's this demand for high energy food that is in a small digestible packet, basically. And when you look at juvenile salmon compared to other foraging options for herons during that time of year, they're kind of the perfect, fix all. They're relatively small compared to the other forage fish. And then they've got this really high fat density and high energy density. So it could be that herons have sort of tweaked their life history and their breeding schedule based on reliable food sources such as juvenile salmon out migrations in the nearby heronries. And I bet that you would see that in years where you have really strong pulses of juvenile salmon going out of the river, you would likely see higher survival in the chicks and higher survival to adulthood in the heron chicks, because they actually have a reliable, safe, relatively safe food option. So it's just another one of those things that I think, because of the technology that was put out and all the money that was put into projects using pit tags, that was not my money, not my energy. I was able to sort of piggyback on that and really look into what I think is a really cool and very interesting species relationship between herons and salmon. And I think it goes both ways. I think it really is something that's important for both of them. And there's a reason that they've been hanging out near each other for such a long time. So just a quick overview. So what impact does heron predation have on the survival of outmigrating salmon smolts? Herons are consistent predators of salmon smolts. They eat about 1 to 3% of the juvenile salmon annually, but can be up to 6% in some years of low river flow. But as I mentioned before, this may actually be beneficial if they're feeding on smaller juvenile salmon that are likely not going to survive to adulthood anyways. It may actually be sort of weaning out the weak in a way, and making more room for larger juvenile salmon to have better survival and better success feeding in the estuary. Where does this predation occur? So the predation occurs primarily in the lower river and the upper estuary. So I did some observations down in Cowichan and basically saw herons shift their movements from the estuary into the river as juvenile salmon were moving out. So they're definitely keying into some juvenile salmon, and that seems to be where they're getting them is as they're coming out of the river. And that does make sense for a couple of reasons, because as a juvenile salmon is coming out, they're introduced to salt water for the first time. And there is this thing called salinity shock, where they basically are a little bit stunned. It takes them a second to realize, basically who turned on the salt around here. And as a result, that little bit of stun may make them actually, a relatively easy target compared to other estuary dwelling food options at that time. Does smolt size influence susceptibility to heron predation? Yes. Smaller juvenile salmon were significantly more susceptible to heron predation, probably for a couple of those reasons that I mentioned earlier, but it could be for other reasons as well, which would be herons specifically targeting fish that are of appropriate size for their rearing chicks. And then what does smolt predation mean for herons? I actually looked into the energetics of, what does a heron chick require during the breeding, during the chick rearing stage when juvenile salmon are present. And it turns out that just looking at hatchery fish alone, so I saw predation on both wild and hatchery fish, and there's generally a lot more wild fish than hatchery fish as far as juvenile numbers are concerned in all of the systems I was working in. And just from hatchery fish alone, up to 11% of the diet could be provided by salmon smolts alone. So likely they have quite a big impact on heron populations, and there's likely a relationship between the health of a salmon population and the health of the heron populations that feed on it. So in all, they're definitely getting quite a bit of energy from these juvenile salmon. And surprisingly, I didn't do this all by myself, so I just wanted to take a second to acknowledge all my collaborators from BC Conservation Foundation, Department of Fisheries and Oceans, Andrew Treitz from the Marine Mammal Research Unit, who, despite me not studying anything about marine mammals, still helped me a whole lot. And then a lot of the pictures that you saw, any of the pictures that didn't have captions underneath, were taken by Robert Stenseth, who was just a man I met down in Cowichan, in the Cowichan estuary, who just had an unbelievably beautiful camera and a very kind heart. And he allows me to use these pictures to sort of tell the story. So I'm very appreciative to him as well. And Pacific Salmon Foundation is who funded a lot of this research, and Cowichan tribes biologists and Cowichan tribes in general. It's just the research wouldn't have been possible without the input from Cowichan tribes. So yeah, I'm very appreciative, and thank you guys so much for listening. I revel in the moment that I get to talk about herons. So I really appreciate this time.
Great.
Well done, Zach.
Thank you, Rob.
That was great.
Yes. If you can stop sharing your screen now.
Can do.
We'll. Excellent. Thank you. Thank you. That was fabulous. Volunteering at a couple of hatcheries myself, having a bit of a background in that. That was great. Thank you. Thank you. Okay. I didn't notice any questions while Zach was talking. It was too interesting. So if anyone's got any questions, Ian will be our moderator, and I'll hand it over to Ian.
And the same wasn't in the chat. There wasn't any questions either. So so far they're just in the chat. There's excellent talk. Thank you from Nancy.
Yeah,
So
I thought I was going to hear some grunts or at least a couple of coughs out there, but I just kept talking. I thought for sure. I thought this was a group effort. So
usually there is the odd sort of sound or background noise, but I think everybody was really zoned in and really watching. So
enthralled. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. Elaine, appears to have a question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering if you have discussed your results with Rob Butler.
Rob Butler was actually on my my thesis committee, and yeah, he was. I reached out to him very early on to finding out about herons. If you Google herons in British Columbia, you come across Rob Butler very quickly. But no, he was a great mentor, and he basically all the stuff that was heron centric that I was doing. He was my main supervisor for all of that aspect of the research. So yeah, but Rob Butler, he deserves big thanks as well.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah. We have a couple of people in the audience tonight, Jim and Judy Atkinson, who have monitored very closely the heron colony in the Shoreline Park in Port Moody. I don't know if you're aware of it or not, and all their hard work and keeping tabs on it.
I wasn't, but thank you so much.
Yeah, thanks, Elaine. Zachary, that was really interesting, and we were looking at each other the whole time you were talking, because now we're trying to connect some dots. And our herons showed up in 2015, and they are placed directly in between our two local hatcheries.
Yeah.
So, and now, you know, and we've been closely. We keep track of the data for Environment Canada, and yeah, we're
33 pledges.
We had, yeah, this year we had, because normally we have two adult eagles doing the predation. For this year, some reason we didn't. We had one juvenile eagle, and who wasn't doing a very good job, who actually would land in the middle of the colony, get pretty confused because he was being attacked by crows, plus being screamed at by the herons, and he'd sit there for a little while, and then he'd take off, or she. And so we had the most productive year we've ever had was this year, because we had 33 fledglings.
No way.
Yeah. So now, and out, you know, yeah, it's quite something, out of 15 nests. So now we're thinking now in another 2 years, of course, there'll be, we're wondering about the expansion of this colony. And we thought, because it's the colony was established right above a small amphibian pond, but now we're wondering, is the colony there because of the two, it's, you know, right in between these two hatcheries?
There is definitely evidence of depredation, which is like stealing of herons at hatcheries, and they a lot of times they'll put in these sort of nets over the hatchery ponds to deter other avian predators as well as herons. So that is the little evidence that there is of heron predation on juvenile salmon often does come from depredation of hatchery systems. But I would definitely look into that. And also if there is any pit tags that are being put out, it'd be a really good option for finding out about that predation. But also, I mean, I don't have to tell you guys, but there's code wire tags as well. They're really hard to find. I thankfully, the pit tags, I could just waft a wand over them and they would detect themselves. But there is an option if it's a relatively small heronry and there's a lot of, there might be a lot of juvenile salmon predation. You might have some luck going in there and finding code wire tags with metal detectors. And we could talk offline because that's the type of thing I like doing on the weekends. So
Okay.
I also wanted to point out that it's not only because of the hatchery location, it just happens that the hatcheries provide fish that are actually released in Sutterbrook Creek, for example.
Yeah.
And I believe that that's likely a more a greater source of predation, because Noons Creek, for example, hatchery does have nets over them. But I think Judy and Jim, you were talking about actually seeing the adults preying at the mouth of Sutterbrook Creek, and they, I believe, release not only chum but coho.
Well, we've got 2 wildlife cameras set up on Sutterbrook, and it's kind of a running joke between us because most of the time they're set up for 10-second videos, and the majority of the camera work is all it's actually 2 herons that have taken over the territory. We can pretty much distinguish these guys now, and they so intermittently the whole camera feed might just be the heron catching fish. And so I've even made short videos of it set to music, because it's, it's just the heron continually catching, and you can sort of tell by looking at the camera which kind of fish, if it's close enough, if they're close enough, I can tell. We can tell if it's a sculpin or if, whatever it is. And they're doing quite a job at this section of Sutterbrook Creek on the wildlife cameras.
Well, this brings up the question I had for Zachary. Is that okay, given this relatively efficient predation, what are we going to do? Is that going to be a threat to our diminishing salmon stocks? Or is that something that nature has provided and we just have to sit by and at least we're aware of what's going on?
I think, because I've been in a couple of meetings where I give a presentation and people, as I went to this one DFO meeting where they were talking about seal culls, and I was in the other group that gave a presentation, and I said, here's another predator, just so you guys know. I mean, it may not be all seals that are causing all this predation. And I've got this response that I don't really expect and I don't support, which is, we'll just cull herons. That seems like a reasonable thing to do. And so Jim, Judy, don't worry.
That's the natural response.
Right. But in that meeting, they in particular, they were interested in, what can we do to save these salmon populations? But as I was mentioning, because the predation is primarily on smaller juvenile salmon, which are less likely to survive to adulthood, it may actually be providing a service. If you were to try to limit heron predation, it may actually be to the detriment of those salmon populations, because now you have an unnaturally high number of less fit individuals surviving to the estuary where there's already food limitation, and they may not be competing super effectively, but if you get enough of them, they're competing well enough and they get a meal every once in a while that the larger conspecifics may be growing less quickly, which would be to their detriment for sure when you have seals and other predators that are hanging around the estuary waiting for fish just like that, pretty much. Plus, if a fish gets hungry, it gets more risky, and it gets into situations that are a bit more hairy for other predators. So if you don't have your large, healthy juvenile salmon feeding effectively in the estuary, you may have them go hungry, and then because of their behavioral switch, they would make themselves more susceptible to other predation, and you might see sort of the opposite effect to what you'd imagine. But no, I don't think that herons are going to be the culprit. I think it's just an indication of it's more so what I saw in this research was an indication of just an extension of how important salmon are at all life history stages for the ecosystem around them. And in this particular instance, just the timing, the overlap with what part of the breeding season the herons are foraging, the type of food that they're looking for at that time, and the type of food that the juvenile salmon can provide. The combination of it all it really came together in a way that seemed like more motivation to help the salmon than to go cull herons or anything like that. But what I would say is, as viable options for actually helping the salmon populations would be, in this particular instance, of like potentially predation during outmigration. So attacking that 50% that aren't going to make it to the estuary. one option you have is that, a lot of rivers in BC and all of the rivers included in my study are weir operated or dam operated. So the option would be providing rationale, which would, this is providing rationale for basically providing a reasonable amount of water for the juvenile salmon to migrate out of the river, as well as provide that enough water for them to access sort of riparian habitat and riparian hiding places, which would help them without directly culling, which is not ever, I don't think humans have the right to really go in, and they never really do what they think they're going to do, especially when I'm mentioning it's much more complex than you would think. But I think one way that you could address it is by providing a naturally high amount of water during that time of year, which is possible with the weirs that we have. And I wouldn't even say like providing a bunch of water. Like if it's a a drought year, it would be a drought year without that weir, and the river level would be low anyways. So I'm not saying that you have to just throw all your water downstream to help these juvenile salmon. I just think operating the weir in a way that is responding and adaptive to the natural rainfall in the system and trying to match that would be the way that I would suggest. So not necessarily like pushing salmon through the system, in which case herons are kind of losing out and maybe other predators are, but more so just sort of getting back in sync with the natural fluctuation of those systems.
Yep. At Noons Creek in Port Moody, we at this time of year, we actually have at least one, if not two, almost resident great blue herons sitting on our net on the rearing pond. And it doesn't matter how high you pull the net, they always manage to get their beaks in there and snaffle off some coho fry or smolts, depending on at what stage they are. Yes, and I think because their rookery is sort of between the two hatcheries, I think that is an attractant. I have no doubt that it probably is. So, but they virtually live on the rearing pond at the hatchery. Two of them.
I think another comment was often at the bottom of Noons Creek hatchery, there are dogs in the water there, disturbing the little salmon when they get into the inlet. I think, forget the fellow's name at Noons Creek's hatchery. He mentioned that could be Dave, yeah, it could be a problem because the dogs are often playing right when they come out of the stream into the inlet.
So you're suggesting we should cull the dogs, is what I'm hearing.
Yes. We've got lots
Yeah.
of signs. There are lots of signs asking people not to do that, but
It's not the dogs that's the problem, it's a human problem.
well, this is
Yeah.
true.
Okay.
No one listens. No one
I don't think we need to go there.
Yeah.
Just teasing. I love dogs.
Are
I
we
don't have a
culling
dog, but
humans
I
now?
swear I love them.
Yeah.
Are we culling humans now?
Yeah.
That's
leading that
probably
way.
where we should start. We want to have an effect.
Exactly.
I'm going to switch gears for a second here away from the dogs. And Zachary, I was wondering, I've read a really interesting paper from Dr. Megan Adams, and it's about the disconnect or the mismatch between salmon and bear management in the province, because one, of course, is managed by the federal government and then bears are managed by the provincial government. And I mean, her suggestion in the paper is to try and make a better connection between the two management policies with regards to bears and salmon. Do you have any opinion about that?
I've not read that, but I would agree. I mean, I also think that it's a bit hard because I have this feeling that federal government, it's hard to manage a whole country, and it's hard to manage a whole country's worth of salmon. I think that where effective management comes in is at the grassroots level. So people who live in the area, people who work at the hatchery, people who observe the wildlife in that area. And then I understand that the federal government runs a lot of the actual monitoring, which is a little bit scant for what it needs to be to really understand if you're going to be basing return numbers and trying to come up with estimates for what the commercial fishery can catch and different things like that. I think they spread themselves relatively thin. I think that I don't know a lot about the bear management, but I think that I I would say that there's a bit of a mismatch in the management of salmon for sure. I think that there's a way to address salmon with a lot more knowledge, or there's a lot more knowledge than is being used to potentially sort of help these salmon populations along. One of the biggest things I think though is freshwater habitat, which would be opening up culverts, floodgates, different things like that, which are generally owned by either the province or they're on crown land, which was originally sort of checked off by the province. And so it's sort of a provincial problem, but it impacts a federally managed stock. So that's kind of a weird disconnect for me too, where if the fish can't get up to the habitat that they need to for the bears to effectively feed on them and provide nutrients for the rest of the organisms up there, but also the trees and the full ecology of that system, cutting off salmon cuts off a lot more than just habitat for salmon, in my opinion. And so I think it's one of those things where you can't really knock something if you don't have a better suggestion. But I think that the federal government management of salmon, I think that the problems aren't necessarily federal. A lot of the problems and a lot of the solutions that are needed are going to be regional or per stock, or at least at the provincial level. So I can't speak to the bear part of it, but I think that, we should let bears and salmon meet in the wild wherever we can. But I think that the current management of salmon populations, it's really hard. Don't get me wrong. Like I have a lot of appreciation for anyone who attempts to manage salmon populations. But it's just, I think there is a disconnect where the solutions are going to come from regional areas, especially when you're talking about specific populations, some of which are doing well, some of which are not doing well. And there's no clear answer as to why one would be, doing well and one not. It's really going to come down to a regional approach, not just a federally managed commercial fishery limitation approach. So I don't know. Basically, I wish I did. Oh, talk to me in 5 years, in 4 years. I'll tell you all about it.
We do have one question from the chat about how are the pits inserted into the juvenile salmon?
Yeah, so it's it basically comes as a disposable needle that you put on the end of an injector, and the tags come basically pre-packaged in these little needles. And you make a small incision, probably maybe a millimeter, maybe 2, just big enough to insert the tag in the stomach cavity, or in the abdominal cavity, not in the stomach, but there's an abdominal cavity that after 60 millimeters, juvenile salmon have this expansion in their abdominal cavity because they're probably expecting to feed a lot, or they've been expected to feed a lot at that point. And that's a good point where you can put the tag in. And it doesn't create any issue, so it doesn't get pushed out, which would be an indication that the area you put it in was too small. But also there seems to be no behavioral difference in juvenile salmon that are tagged and not tagged. But basically, it's just a small incision in the abdomen, and then you push the tag in, and it heals itself. So we had when we were tagging hatchery fish, I was assisting in tagging hatchery fish. Actually, I wasn't running the operation, but when we were tagging hatchery fish, I think we had over 95% of the tags were retained, and the 5% that fell out were simply because the incision was made just a little bit too large, or the salmon was moving around in such a crazy manner that the tag didn't know what to do and it just popped out. But yeah, so it's a small incision in the abdomen, and then you basically push it in, and then you get rid of the disposable. I think it's recyclable, but the recyclable needle, and then you pick up another one, and then it's got a tag preloaded in it. You make the incision, put it in.
Thanks. So I think we're a bit after 9 o'clock here now.
Oh my goodness.
Yes. So
Yeah.
Victoria, did you want to?
Okay, yeah. Well, Zachary, I think you have a real talent for describing the big picture. I just love how you talked about not just the interconnectedness between the salmon and the bears and the trees and the insects, but also the interconnectedness with your research and the Cowichan tribes and the people who put these pit tags in the fish, 300,000 fish or something they've done it to. It's just remarkable. It's a really, really good story. But even better than that, you are a master storyteller. I think
Yeah.
I can't wait to see what you do the rest of your career. I think it's going to be pretty exciting.
Oh,
So
thank you so much.
Thank you very, very much for telling us this story this evening. We really, really appreciate it.
It's all my pleasure. Trust me. I
can
don't
see
do
you
it for
enjoy
the,
it.
I
Yeah.
don't do it for the honorarium. I tell you that much. I really,
Oh, good thing.
yeah,
Just
keep
kidding.
that over there.
No, thanks.
I
Thanks
really
very much.
appreciate you
Zachary.
guys. And,
Yeah.
and I can tell when I've, it's really nice because I feel, even when I just peep over and look at you guys on the cameras, it's what, it's what
Yeah.
I feel like I'm talking right to you guys. And I just want to share what I know because I think it's interesting. And I know you guys know all sorts of things that I find interesting. So it's just me trying to get to the end of it so that we can talk and chat.
Yeah. Well, look at the time too. I mean, time flies when you're having fun, right?
Yeah.
So I'm going to hand the mic over to Brian now, and we'll have our wildlife sightings session.
Awesome.
Yes.
Awesome. Thank you, Victoria. And thank you, Ian. Because of the lateness of the hour, we actually don't have all that many wildlife sightings this month, so that's probably a good thing. We can abbreviate this a little bit. So, okay, I will start sharing my screen, and those who have some sightings, I have the pictures in the gallery. Can everyone see my screen?
Yes.
Yep.
Yes.
Okay. Okay. Let's move on. Okay. This is really
Oh, wow.
wildlife.
Ooh.
Thank you, Ian.
Yes.
Yeah.
So this was taken on the, as you can see, the village trail on Brook Mountain, and I just thought it was really cool. Just I felt it to be sort of a family of mushrooms. So
Looks great.
Great photo.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Beautiful.
Oh, John, you're up.
Yes, Christine and I happened to be walking at the Beauville Slough, and I had my long lens camera, so I was able to capture this very healthy looking coyote across the side channel in the blueberry fields, enjoying this rare bit of sunshine.
Yeah, rare this week. Yes.
Ooh.
Oh,
And once again, I have to say that with my long lens, I was not very close. I was able to take this picture without disturbing the bear, and just took a couple shots and then moved on. I try to do ethical photography whenever I get a chance, but thank goodness at this time of the year, we have some wonderful native Pacific crabapple trees, and it amazes me. This rather large 2 to 3 year old bear was able to climb on relatively small branches. Here he is, or she, trying to come down the tree, but thank goodness for the apples at this time of the year. The bears seem to get a lot of nutrition from them.
Totally.
And this was again at the Beauville Slough.
Beautiful photo.
And this started out by, I wanted to capture the feet of this double-crested cormorant. But then when I looked a lot closer, I realized I didn't see it through the binoculars, but when I zoomed in, and the next picture will show it even better, you may be able to see fishing line around the cormorant's neck. And there is
yeah,
a
I can see
piece
it.
of,
Yeah.
you can also see the material hanging down from his bill.
Yeah.
You suspect that it's a fishing hook stuck in the bill.
Oh,
I did report this to Wildlife Rescue, and they said that they've had several sightings
oh dear.
from not only this bird but other birds. I made a report, and they said, unfortunately, unless they're in distress, there's not much they can do because they're so effective at diving, and they're very difficult to capture. I watched the bird with Christina for some time, and I realized that fortunately, it's a relatively short piece of line. It was not, didn't affect its ability to fly or dive. And more importantly, it wasn't wrapped around its bill, so it could easily open its bill quite wide. And it looked relatively well fed. So all we can do is, I posted in Friends of Blakeburn Lagoon's Facebook to ask other people to just keep an eye on the bird in the next few days if it happens to be out there. And if it gets to the point that it gets malnourished and weakened, they may be able to capture it if need
Yeah.
be.
John Long.
That's Ron. Long.
Ron
Yeah, it's
Long.
Ron Long. Yeah.
Oh,
Who's John?
You don't have a brother
think-
named John?
oh,
Oh no.
I've buggered that up on every one of them. Oh, I'm terribly sorry. Oh my God.
Actually,
God.
John Long was my grandfather, but I don't think they had telephoto lenses.
Ron, I am so sorry. I'm so
That's all
sorry.
right. So lately, I've been picking up on strange visitors in my yard. I've become so tuned in to my backyard that any little twitch of a leaf attracts my attention, and it's been paying off lately. And I don't know how rare these are. I just know that they don't show up in my yard. So if any of you have got any information about any of these guys, I'd sure appreciate knowing it. Here again, I'm doing grab shots just to make a record. So some of these pictures are not up to my my usual standard, but I just want a record shot to try and identify them from. And if I could throw it away.
That's a nice one. Yeah.
Yeah, that is nice. Some
So-
record shot.
Wow.
Oh, nice.
So are any of these unusual in any way, or are they common around here?
Like I rarely see the Pacific slope flycatcher. I hear them in the forest all the time, but
Yeah.
to see them is
So, but they are around, eh?
Ron, when were these pictures taken? Are they relatively recent?
Yes, relatively recent, over the last, probably 6 weeks.
I think what you're seeing possibly, and we're finding the same thing in our colony farm bird count, is that in the fall you have a reverse migration of birds coming through that you normally wouldn't see, except for that short window where they're stopping over, getting food for a few days, and then continuing south. So it's a reverse of what you see in the spring.
Yeah.
Ooh,
Oh,
nice.
Oh, yeah.
There's a few regulars that I've got more pictures of pileated woodpeckers because they're here all the time. But this particular male was just so spectacular and believe it or not, it was raining quite hard when I made this photograph. So
The colors are fabulous.
this is part of my, if you heard my talk about photographing from my kitchen, this is exactly how this was done, through the double glass of the patio door from my kitchen.
Wow.
And,
so how often are you cleaning that glass?
well, actually, fairly often, Ian. It does become important.
Love that.
Great.
Lovely.
Yeah, and here again, I just can't pass up these guys. They're here all day, every day, but they're just such neat little guys. And again, I've got 100 pictures of them, but I keep getting more. And this was also done yesterday or day before
Very
yesterday.
nice. Yeah.
And that's the rarity.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, thanks
Yeah.
for that, Victoria. I'm really appreciate knowing that.
Yeah.
Now I just have to hope he hangs around so I can get a really nice portrait of him.
But you're very lucky, Ron, to have all those different species coming into your yard.
Yeah.
So,
Is that right?
Beautiful.
Yeah.
This guy is just spectacular with that.
The enter button is here.
The it's not just yellow on the top of the head. There's orange and yellow.
Yeah.
So golden crown, and I only saw him for a couple of seconds, and luckily my camera was right there and I was able to get the shot once again. But what's interesting about all of this is that I lived in this house which backs onto Nunes Creek Ravine, and for 30 years, and I was never aware of birds. And I used to scratch my head and wonder, but when I started feeding birds and there's more activity, even with the juncos and the chickadees are always around, but their activity seems to attract other birds.
Mhm.
And so
Yeah.
now I've got this wonderful thing going on. I even had a bobcat kitten
Mm.
show up a few days ago, just checking out the activity under the bird
Wow.
feed.
Very good.
Okay, thank you, folks.
Yeah, no, fabulous.
Thank you,
John.
John, or
Yeah.
John, whatever alias you're going by today. Apologies again. I'm terrible. I messed up the editing there. So.
No,
Yeah, that's part of the comedy of this night.
Yeah, it is.
Great
That's all.
photos, yeah.
My contact is
Thank
That's
you,
all,
Brian.
folks.
Sherker Z.
Okay, so I will stop sharing and back to Victoria.
Okay. Well, I can't believe it's 9:14.
Yeah.
But the good thing is we're going to get together again next week. So if you have any wildlife sightings that you didn't get a chance to mention tonight, save them for next week. And we'll hope we might have a little bit more time then, but who knows?
That's
Really-
Sherker.
Really, sorry, Jim, really enjoyed the presentation this evening. Love the photographs that
Thank you, Jeffrey.
everybody prepared and sent earlier. And I think we better close off now at 9:15. We're getting lots of, Zachary, you're getting lots of compliments through the chat function, as you
yeah.
probably see. And hope to see you all next week.
Yeah, and
Next Thursday.
Zachary as well. Come out and
Yes,
see
I'll send you
about
the link.
Mount Gillespie area.
Yes.
Please do keep me in the loop. I am
Yeah.
free most weeks
Oh.
at this hour.
I will
Great.
send you the link to the, well, when it gets created, we'll send you the link to the Zoom for next Thursday.
Oh, thank you so much.
You're
Thank you
welcome.
guys for having me. I really appreciate it.
Yeah, we appreciate
you.
it as well.
Yeah, thank you, thank you.
Hey, Zach.
Okay.
Hey, thank you.
Good night, everybody.
Good night.